ஜடாய் சார் ஜாயின் பண்ணிட்டாரு.
வணக்கம் சார்.
வணக்கம், வெல்கம் சார். வெல்கம் ஜடாய் சார். வெல்கம்.
நமஸ்தே ஜி. நமஸ்தே ஜி.
நமஸ்தே. என்னோட வீடியோ ஓகேயா? ஆடியோ ஓகே தானே? ஏதாவது ஹெட்செட் தேவைப்படுதா இல்ல இது பரவாயில்லையா?
ரெண்டுமே பெர்ஃபெக்ட்.
ஓகே. ஒரு 40 நிமிஷம் சொன்னீங்க இல்லையா சார் சம்பத்குமார் சார்?
டேக் யுவர் ஓன் டைம், நோ ப்ராப்ளம் சார். 40 ல இருந்து 50 கூட.
ஓகே. என்கிட்ட 14 ஸ்லைடு இருக்கு.
நோ இஷ்யூ ஜி, நோ ப்ராப்ளம். ஒரு
ஸ்லைடு டைட்டில் ஸ்லைடு, சோ 13 ஸ்லைடு தான். ஒரு ஸ்லைடுக்கு ஒரு அதிகபட்சம் ஒரு 3 நிமிஷம் அந்த மாதிரி, ஒரு 4 நிமிஷம் கரெக்டா இருக்கும். 40 மினிட்ஸ்ல எண்ட் ஆயிடும். அதுக்கப்புறம் ஏதாவது Q&A மாதிரி இருக்குமா?
இருக்கு சார். யாராவது இன்ட்ரெஸ்ட் இருக்கிறவங்க ஏதாவது கேட்டாங்கன்னா.
ஓகே, ஷூர். அது பார்த்தேன் லைவ் ஸ்ட்ரீம். இது எங்கேயோ ஒரு இடத்துல எக்கோ வருது.
யாருதுங்க?
வருதுங்களா ஜி?
இப்பதான் வந்தது. இது வரைக்கும் வரல.
ரெண்டு டிவைஸ் கனெக்ட் பண்றீங்களா? 2 டிவைசஸ்
இல்லையே, நான் ஒண்ணுதான்.
இல்ல, இப்ப போயிடுச்சு எக்கோ.
நமஸ்தே. நமஸ்தே ஜி.
நமஸ்தே ஜி. நமஸ்தே. நமஸ்தே யோகானந்தன் ஜி. யோகானந்தன் ஜி நமஸ்தே.
ஜடாஜி, லாஸ்ட் நம்ம இன்டராக்ஷன் ஆன் தாய்மானவர் பச்சையபாஸ் காலேஜ்ல.
ஆமா கரெக்ட். அதுக்கப்புறம் நம்ம Facebookல அப்பப்ப பேசிட்டு இருக்கோம். ஆனா நேர்ல பார்த்து பேசல இல்லையா?
ஆமா. இப்பயும் எக்கோ வருதுன்னு நினைக்கிறேன்.
ஆமா, இப்ப யாரோ ஒருத்தர் புதுசா ஜாயின் பண்ண ஒருத்தங்க காரணமா எக்கோ வருதுன்னு.
ஜி, அது ஃபேன் சவுண்ட். ஃபேன் எங்கேயோ ஓடிட்டு இருக்கு.
ஓ ரைட்.
ஓ அப்படியா?
எஸ்.
இங்க நான் ஃபேன் போட்டிருக்கேன், அதை நான் ஆஃப் பண்ணிடுறேன்.
இல்ல, நீங்க ஸ்லோவா வச்சுக்கலாம் ஜி.
இல்ல, ஸ்லோவா தான் வச்சிருக்கேன். இருந்தாலும் அப்படி எக்கோ வந்ததுன்னா ஓகே, ஆஃப் பண்ணிட்டேன்.
ஓகே. சித்தேஸ்வரன், பிஃபோர் தட் இருக்கிறவங்களை இன்ட்ரோடியூஸ் பண்ணிக்கலாமே. அவங்க லெட் அஸ் ஸ்டார்ட் வித் சித்தேஸ்வரன். நீங்களே ஜாயின் பண்ணுங்க முதல்ல. ஓகேவா சித்தேஸ்வரன்? சொல்லுங்க. இல்ல, நீங்க உங்களை இன்ட்ரோடியூஸ் பண்ணுங்க. அந்த மாதிரி இருக்கிற ஒரு முக்கியமானவங்க இன்ட்ரோடியூஸ் பண்ணிக்கிட்டா நல்லா இருக்கும். அதுக்காக.
நமஸ்தே, ஐ எம் டாக்டர் சித்தேஸ்வரன், கன்வீனர் வித்யாபாரதி உச்ச சிக்ஷா சன்ஸ்தான் தமிழ்நாடு, and the convener of this program, and Sambhaji is the academic convener of this Vidyabharati Ucha Shiksha Sansthan.
Namaste to all.
And also we have the members, various the academic council members, and as well as the advisory committee members, including the core committee members like Dr. Yoganandam, Director, Idal Academy, and so many members. Okay.
Sir, அந்த டேஷ்போர்டு வருது இப்ப ஸ்கிரீன்ல, அதுக்கு பதிலா வேற யாராவது பேசுறவங்களுடைய ஃபேஸ் வரா மாதிரி பண்ண முடியுமா?
Yes, G, because now I am sharing the screen. Okay.
சரி.
Okay.
ஸ்டார்ட் பண்ணிடலாம், நீ உங்களை பொறுத்தான். நான் ரெடி.
Very good evening to all. Let's start our today's program with the prayer song Saraswati Vandan.
Ya kundendu tusharhara dhavala, ya shubhravastravruta, ya veena varadanda manditakara, ya shweta padmasana, या ब्रह्माच्युत शंकर प्रभृतिः देवैः सदा वन्दिता, सा मां पातु सरस्वती भगवती निःशेषजाड्यापहा। ब्रह्मविचारसार परमा, आद्यां जगद्व्यापिनीं, वीणा पुस्तकधारिणीम् अभयदा, जाड्यान्धकारापहा, हस्ते स्फाटिकमालिकां विदधतीं, पद्मासने संस्थितां, वन्दे तां परमेश्वरीं भगवतीं, बुद्धिप्रदां शारदाम्।
There is a sense of widespread neglect and decay in the field of indigenous education within a few decades after the onset of British rule. With this quote of Sri Dharampal'S, I feel proud to start today's webinar, Sri Dharampal'S works, Valuable Resources in Decolonization Narratives, organized by Vidya Bharathi Ucha Shiksha Sansthan, Tamil Nadu. On the occasion of centenary celebration of Sri Dharampal, a Gandhian thinker, historian, and a political philosopher who explored the truth and the urgent need for an objective understanding about India's past before the onslaught of colonial rule. He decided to embark on the exploration of British Indian archival materials based on the documentations emanating from the commissioned surveys of East India Company. It has been lodged in various depositories spread over the British landmass. His pioneering historical research, conducted intensively over a decade, and led to the publications of work in field of Indian studies, including education, society, polity, etc. To understand and know more about Sri Dharampal'S creations, we have invited our great literacy enthusiast and an author, Sri Jatayu, one of the founder and editor of the magazine Tamil Hindu and authors of various magazines. On behalf of Vidya Bharathi Ucha Shiksha Sansthan Tamil Nadu, I am privileged to invite our today's chief guest, Sri Jatayu. Welcome, Ji. Namaste, Ji.
Namaste.
On behalf of our Vidya Bharathi Ucha Shiksha Sansthan Tamil Nadu, we also express our gratefulness for accepting our invitation to speak about Sri Dharampal'S. Now, I would like to brief about our organization, Vidya Bharathi Ucha Shiksha Sansthan. Vidya Ucha Shiksha Sansam is a voluntary organization working in the field of education with a primary focus on policy implementation and structural reforms in India's higher education landscape. The core concept of idea of Vidya Ucha Shiksha Sansam are to address the emerging need of quality education and to reflect the framework of Bharatheya knowledge concept, practice, philosophy, and approach. The organization has emerged as a transforming voice and a movement led by learned, eminent educationists, scholars, and concerned citizens of modern day India. Vidya Ucha Shiksha Sansam firmly believes that a conducive education systems could be developed through contact, dialogue, discourage, and coordinations among the institutions of higher education. Vidya Ucha Shiksha Sansam has been actively engaged in constructive engagements, developing thought process, policy interventions, and recommendations. Engaging stakeholders in the synthesizing of National Education Policy NEP 2020 is one of the activities that Vidya Ucha Shiksha Sansam strongly commit and advocates. In the recent years, since its inception from 2018, the organization has been relentlessly engaged in numerous activities to promote, create awareness, decoding NEP 2020. Having done a series of thought process and submitting a policy recommendations of UBESS is also playing a crucial participatory role in the policy implementation and practices. The important action plans of the Vidya Ucha Shiksha Sansam is to associate with the institutions agreeing with the aim and objectives of the VBUSS, to establish continuous communications, coordination, and cooperations with the associated institutions, to assist in the development of institutions on the basis of mutual support by determining college clusters based on certain geographical area, to identify experimental, quality, and prestigious institutions and to share their ideas of excellence with other institutions, to provide support to various organizations to accelerate their work, to review the syllabus, book, and activities and gives suggestions to the concerned government agencies and also help in the designing of syllabus and curriculum, setting up of research agenda, to create public awareness on the problems and challenges of contemporary and important social, national, and international issues, to publish journals, literary works, to organize seminars, conferences, which creating research environment, to help in planning the activities related to skill development, to constitute expert group, to advise, to guide, and support higher education institutions, to study issues and rules and instructions related to higher educations, keeping up-to-date information and communicating it to the associated institutions, to interact with the academicians, teachers, and thinkers of important and contemporary issues and points, to assist higher education institutions in quality enhancement process, to give suggestions to identify, enlist, and organize alumni and motivate them to work in interest of institution, society, and nation, to organize counseling and monitoring programs regulatory for students, to plan and promote multilingual competence, to help in making colleges, libraries, and laboratories rich activities useful with the latest technology, to encourage interdisciplinary research focusing on local, national, and global needs, to facilitate availability of institutions, to develop various research institutions, to strive give proper place in Indian knowledge and tradition in the field of research. Like that, we have so many objectives of Vidya Ucha Shiksha Sansam. With this, now I would like to invite Dr. Sampath Kumar Jiri to explain the objectives of the webinar and to introduce our chief guest. Over to you.
Good evening to all. Respected Jatayu my good friend Siddheswaran, Yoganandanji, Dr. Selvaraj, Dr. Srinivasan, Dr. Badrinath, Professor SHRI from Trichy who has joined, and all the participants. It's very, really, I feel happy to have such a program in the midst of the pandemic and other things. Actually, we thought of offline meeting so that the ideas of Dharampal may reach to the wider audience. But still, we hope that next month we will have a offline meeting in one of the institutions, because now most of the institutions are running their examinations. So students and teachers are not available. So we are planning next month on the works of Dharampal, of course, on different topic, of course. You know well that Sri Dharampal, a Gandhian core to the core, Gandhian to the core, who lived in the ashram where Gandhi lived for many years there. He studied all the, what you call, the manuscript. Even some of the manuscripts were not published. Gandhi's unpublished manuscripts were accessible to Sri Dharampalji, whose centenary year is now this year, 2022. Let me say few ideas or few words about Dharampal, then our guest, then I will give it to the guest who will speak more about the works of Dharampal and its significance. As I said, Dharampal, a celebrated Gandhian, the original Indian thinker, whose centenary falls during this year 2022. We have to take the ideas and works or the contents or the subject about which Dharampal published books to the public to the public in general, and to the academic in particular, academic world, because a lot of scope are there to explore further research. His extensive research on the Indian polity during British rule and even before is an eye-opener for many, particularly in the field of education. Actually, his research works topsy-turvied many of the theories proposed by the Dravidian politics. Dharampal was associated himself with the Gandhian movement and Panchayat Raj system, and had examined extensively the British records held in London as well as in Chennai, particularly Chennai archives, about Bharatheya education, rural technology, polity, administrative system adopted by the indigenous people before the onset of British rule in India. Based on his archival collections, he realized that there was a system of well-functioning societal mechanism for maintaining a beneficial social. See, the point is beneficial social order. And there was economic equilibrium among the diverse local communities. This you find from his works. The documents that he perused mapped out the cultural, social, and political history of the subcontinent in the pre and the early colonial period. For example, his findings on Indian history from 17th to 20th century contested hitherto historical master narratives. He brought out volumes on those topics based on his research. Even though Bharath was under alien rule for nearly 700 years before British came, its economy, technology, political administration was better than any other Western nation states. Unfortunately and cleverly, the British Raj in India destroyed the indigenous system. Some of the Dharampal's works, I would like to say, what are the works? One is the Indian Science and Technology in the 18th century, published in 1971. In this work, what was intended. Quote, I just quote one quotation from his work, then I will go to other. I am not going to explain every book, but one or two pertinent part. To initiate a paradigm shift in India's modernizing agenda. That is the intention of the particular work, Indian Science and Technology in the 18th Century, published in 1975. According to him, again the quote, the still existing indigenous expertise needed to be taken into serious consideration in order to stimulate innovation and creativity, inspired by the grassroots in the ongoing developmental enterprises. So this is the intention of publishing this particular book. Then, of course, this civil disobedience and Indian tradition. Again, 1971, he published it. This book underscores the Indian embeddedness of Gandhian Satyagraha. The empirical data that he brought out on massive movement of resistance showed, quote again, how socio-political and cultural expressions of popular demands safeguarded the interest of the government and the rule. There is no one-sided one. Of course, another book is the Madras Panchayat System, published in 1972. Then another important book is Beautiful Tree, Indigenous Indian Education in 18th Century. It was published in 1983. This one is a very, very acclaimed, the most acclaimed of all these publications. Actually, this broke the myth about India, which got the boon of education only from British Raj as part of their civilizing mission. This is popularly, notoriously held view by many, the so-called educationist and historian, but that is not true. That myth is broken by DHARAMPAL'S book, The Beautiful Tree. It will definitely inspire the educationists today to provide a corrective to the present dilemma created by semi-westernized schooling, which alienated the youth from their familiar environments and produced mostly unemployed graduates. Another book is Some Aspects of Earlier Indian Society and Polity and Their Relevance to the Present, published in 1986. Another book is India's Polity, Its Characteristics and Current Problem. And another one is Bharatheya, Chitta, Manas and Kala. This is also, I feel, whatever the book, I feel inspired. I mean, I got some inspiration from that, about which I will give one quote, not other things. For example, Bharatheya, Chitta, Manas and Kala, it's a modern cosmology. You see, you know all well what cosmology says, the Western cosmology and then Indian cosmology about the universe. This Bharatheya, Chitta, Manas and Kala. What are the component parts of Bharatiya cultural ethos and how they are at odds with modern conception? This is discussed in this book. One should understand the philosophical cosmology of Indian knowledge system in order to develop self-confidence. And this system is defined by, of course, totally a different logic. Now, what is needed now? We have to undertake extensive research throughout the subcontinent that could corroborate or amend and supplement the British testimony to subsequently provide a more holistic understanding of India's recent past and the functioning of its society. By doing so, we may get suggestions how to educate, implement developmental agenda, policy making, local governance, etc. The forerunner for this is to organize a series of seminars, lectures, conferences in different parts of Tamil Nadu. That's what we are intended to do. During the centenary year of Dharampal, we have to revisit his works and bring out the essence and the relevant politics practiced by our forefathers. We are inviting scholars who are experts in this area for a series of lectures, and based on their views, Vidya Bharati will take up to the academic world and to the government for implementation. So we thought of to start our lecture series. Sri Jadayu is a right person, we thought, and Jadayuji immediately accepted my proposal, and he has come to this program to give a lecture on the above topic. Actually, Mr. Jadayu has been writing and speaking on a range of topics on spiritual, cultural, historical themes and Hindutva since 2005, both in Tamil and in English. He is well read on the Hindu philosophy, history, culture, and arts. He is a scholar of Tamil literature, especially Kambaramayana and Bhakti poetry. A collection of his Tamil essays has been published as a book, Kalandorum Narasimham. An important book. Everyone should read. That is my suggestion. He published it in 2015. Basically, he is an electronics technology professional by vocation. He is currently a resident of Bangalore. You know, his real name is Shankar Narayan. He is a regular contributor to the online magazine as well as print magazine, Swarajya, India Facts, Tamil Hindu, Valam Online, and other important magazines, as Siddheshwaran was mentioning. And moreover, he is an active social media activist, I can say. He's a social media activist. And I'm really enthralled by his thought-provoking, in-depth analysis of issues, whether it is the current issue of hijab or earlier issues of Sabarimala. A very balanced and pointed explanation used to give. I never miss his Facebook comments on the current political and social issues. With this, a few words about Jadayuji and then on Dharampal. Now I request Jadayuji to take over and let us enjoy and experience his speech or a lecture on Dharampal's work. Thank you. Thank you to everyone.
Namaste all. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Good evening, everyone, and namaskaram, vanakkam. Thank you, Vidya Bharati Uch Siksh Samsthan, for inviting me to give a webinar on Sri Dharampal, whose work I have studied to some extent and whose views I like a lot. And thank you, Professor Sampath Kumar ji, for remembering me to invite for this talk here. So without much ado, let me just get into my presentation. So this talk will be for something like 35 to 40 minutes. I would limit it to that time. And after that, we can have a Q&A session if any of you have any questions. So before I begin my talk, just a quick poll. How many of you have read at least one book of Dharampal? Some of them you can raise a hand or put something. Okay, so I see a few hands going up. That's very good. So let me share my screen. I hope you all can see the presentation.
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes. Okay. So the topic of today's talk is Dharampal's works, valuable resources in the decolonization narratives. No, the title has decolonization, but this talk is in English, a language that we have inherited as part of colonization. So just as a symbolic, gesture, I have put the title also in Tamil, Dharampal Nulgal, Koloniya Taka Nikathirkana Siranda Valigattigal. So I could have given this talk entirely in Tamil as well, but because this is a national webinar and the professor requested me to give a talk in English, and of course, Dharampal's works are in English, though the translation have come. Originally, he wrote them in English, so it's because almost all of them are scholarly works. So English still being the scholarly language at a global level, we hold this talk in English. So okay. Next. What is decolonization? So we are all familiar with the history, and colonization is a major accident or incident, whatever you call it, in the world history. Many countries across the world have undergone through this experience of colonization. Right? So there have been colonizing powers, primarily the Western countries, and also there have been countries that were colonized. And for the colonizer countries, it has been an experience of dominance, subjugating others, and also amassing a lot of wealth, increasing their power and all that. And the countries which were subjected to colonization, it has been a highly traumatic experience. So this whole process called colonization, it's a very important thing. So the countries, by the 20th century, by the middle of the 20th centuries, most of the countries which were under colonization got independence, right? Politically, they became free countries, but still the impact of colonization, it's not something that is small. So that has been lingering on the psyche and the culture and the whole societies of these colonized countries. So the process by which this impact is reduced and gradually eliminated, that is called decolonization. Just to give an analogy, so let's say some toxin gets into your body, right? So you remove it, and that process is called detox, right? Or detoxification. So in a similar way, whatever has been the impact of colonization, when you systematically work towards removing it, that is what is decolonization. So it is an ongoing project, not just in independent India, but every country. You take, you see Africa, you see South America, any country that suffered the colonization, every country is working on this active project of decolonization, albeit with a lot of difficulty. It's not that easy. It's much easier to do than to say than doing it. So this is an ongoing project in independent India. It's one of the most important projects. Why? Because this is related to our very own national identity, national pride, and everything associated with that. So it involves a few key things. First and foremost, rewriting our true history and rediscovering our scientific heritage. Why? Because as you know, the history is always written by the winners, right? So when the British colonizers subjugated us, they wrote the history for us. So whatever they bestowed as history to us. That's what became our history textbook, our entire understanding of history for the generations to come. Even during the colonial rule, nationalist historians like starting from Jadunath Sarkar to Radha Kumud Mukherjee to Nilakanta Shastri, they all challenged the colonial narratives of history, and they did original research to bring out the true history of India. But unfortunately, even after our independence, due to the kind of governments that we had and the ideologies those governments supported, we still have a lot of colonial hangovers in the history being taught. So rewriting our true history is one major aspect, and rediscovering our scientific heritage. In fact, during the colonial era, we were told that we didn't really have anything called scientific heritage. We were kind of, a semi-civilized people, and it is the British rule that brought civilization to us. So we really didn't have anything, but that is not the truth. So rediscovering our scientific heritage is another major aspect of this. And it is not just an academic exercise. You rewrite the history, you just create some presentations about your scientific heritage. That is not enough. We really need to use that for rebuilding our country. What do we mean by that? Rebuilding our governance structures, our politics, our institutions, our education system, and all fields free from the colonial mindset. Because in every field, you see a lot of trace of colonial mindset still lingering in India. So rebuilding all this free from those colonial impacts and influences. So that is another major aspect of decolonization. And of course, giving pride of place to Indian languages, Indian heritage, Indian arts, Indian mannerism, everything Indian. So that is another aspect. And all this is linked to asserting our national identity and national pride. So it is a very big topic. And if I have to give you practical examples, you see it all over. So you take educational institutions. There are the graduation ceremonies in many educational institutions, right? So till a few years back, all the educational institutions had that black coat and that headgear in black, which was a colonial era paraphernalia that was visible in all the graduation ceremonies. But someone questioned that. And nowadays, you see many universities having our Indian dress, very colorful, vibrant, bright, Swadeshi dress as part of the graduation ceremonies, right? So this is one small symbolic example. So you see the way our courts were functioning. So there have been many reforms, and still a lot more are needed to remove the colonial influences. And the way the history was taught, there have been changes. Just 2 days back, the National Medical Council, they were announcing the terms and conditions and some details about the medical admissions this year. There was a note saying that in place of the Hippocratic oath, right, which is based on the Greek culture that was being practiced in the oath-taking ceremonies of medical students when they were graduating, So that is going to be replaced by the Maharshi Charak Shapath. So as many of you may know, this Maharshi Charaka and Sushruta, they were great Ayurveda physicians of ancient India. In fact, plastic surgery, Sushruta is hailed as the father of surgery all over the world. Even Western nations accept it. So when we have such a great medical heritage in our country, we are not even giving a symbolic, place of pride to it in our medical institutions. So the government and the National Medical Council have actually thought about it. So this year they have made this wonderful announcement, and we have great medical systems in this country, Ayurveda, and wellness systems like yoga, but only in the last 4 or 5 years or so, we have a separate ministry called Ayush Ministry, right? So these are, you can link every one of these measures into decolonization, right? So that is how broad this topic is. So we need to know what is the real impact of British rule in India. Many a times, whatever is taught in our school textbooks is actually very minuscule of what was the reality. And even people who are in, let's say, humanities streams, history or economics and those branches of discipline, they don't have a complete idea of how India was ravaged during the British rule. We read some very oft-repeated narratives, like how Indian farmers were discouraged from growing food grains, and how they were forced to grow indigo for dyeing the textiles, and how the cotton that was grown in India was exported to Britain, and how the finished goods were imported into India and sold at higher price, and how this destroyed the indigenous weaving craft in India, and how in lakhs and lakhs the weavers became paupers in such a short time, and they just died. And as a side effect, it also caused artificially created famines in India, in which millions of people died, right? So things like famine are normal in pre-modern times in many countries, but the kind of famines that were created by the British colonial regime were artificial. It was, they were not natural famines. So they were kind of created because of the criminal policies of the British government to economically exploit India and kill its indigenous industry, crafts, and everything. So so this is such a depressing story. And we know the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, his major research was actually based on the famine of Bengal, for which he got the Nobel Prize, right? So millions of Indians died in famines. So that is one part. The other part is that Indian crafts, industry, economy, everything was destroyed, and there was direct loot of Indian wealth. So as per the current recent estimates, which come from Britishers themselves, Britain stole no less than 45 trillion from India. So we are talking about India becoming $1 trillion economy now. But just compare that with the extent of loot that has happened during the British rule in India. Mind-boggling. And the third aspect, so the indigenous education destroyed, it was replaced by Macaulay's system. So the famines and the other things, when they physically and materially deprived Indians of their body and soul, this replacement of the education system, it totally corrupted the mind of Indians in such a way that all the pride and all the grounding and the rootedness they had in their culture and their traditional education, it was all uprooted. And in place of it, an education system was brought in that was aimed at creating cheap clerks and administrators and employees for the British government, and in such a way that it will cultivate a mindset by which Indians will be kind of for a very long time enslaved to the British crown and also the Western thought process. So it was such a devious plan, the Macaulay system. And prior to the British colonization, the Indian civilization was already wounded during Islamic invasions and Islamic rules. Of course, India didn't succumb to that. Had it succumbed, India would have become a sort of Islamic country, which never happened. That's because we were constantly fighting the Islamic colonization. So we hear about the brave Rajputs, Marathas, Vijayanagara Empire, the Nayaka kings, wave after wave of invasions, and the Islamic tyranny was resisted by India. So it was also a colonization, because in the words of Will Durant, the famous American historian, the Islamic conquest of India is probably the bloodiest story in history. It's a discouraging tale, for its evident moral is that civilization is a precious good whose delicate complex of order and freedom, culture and peace can at any moment be overthrown by barbarians, invading from without or multiplying within. It's a very profound quote. I'm not going to explain this to you. There are books like The Legacy of Muslim Rule in India by the famed historian K.S. Lal, and the other book, Islamic Jihad, by another famed historian, M.A. Khan. So these books explain the process of Islamic colonization. So as you know, so in the first wave of Islamic colonization, a lot of loot happened. So we know about Muhammad of Ghazni and Ghori. And in the next wave, it became a rule inside India, but still the native people of this country, the Hindus, were subjected to innumerable cruelties. And there was jizya tax and other economic exploitations. But the Indian civilization was not completely destroyed. It was wounded and it was fighting. And at that point in history, the British colonization happened, right? So this was the context in which Dharampal sets most of his books, which are based on historical investigation of data. So before delving into his works, a very quick life sketch of Dharampal. He was born in the year 1922, and he lived up to 2006, very recent times. What a phenomenal and tremendous life. He was a child of the Gandhian era. So that was a self-identification of Dharampal in one of his books, Understanding Gandhi. At a very early age, he got involved in Quit India movement as part of the freedom struggle. And along with that, not just the political movement, he was very much interested in rural rehabilitation and rural development. And after this Quit India phase, he actually traveled to Britain. He traveled to Israel through Britain and studied some of the innovative agricultural practices of Israel, and also some of their community living practices like kibbutz. And after that, he was enrolled in London School of Economics. So that is where he developed his major scholarship, which helped him write some of those phenomenal books. And then he got involved in this Association of Voluntary Agencies for Rural Development Award, All India Panchayat Parishad. Later days in his life, Sevagram Ashram. He was also one of the founders of the earliest rural cooperative movements in India. And he worked with Meera Bahan, who was a British disciple of Gandhiji, and also Jayaprakash Narayan, the grassroots leader who fought against emergency in the 1970s. So Dharampal was a widely traveled person. So apart from these foreign countries, so inside India, he traveled to many parts of India and lived with many communities of different social strata and different cultural practices. So this gave him a very profound and deep understanding of India, its people, and its culture. And with all this, he indulged in 2 decades of exploration of Indian archives spread over British isles, predominantly in the United Kingdom, because the British colonial rule was for such a long time in India, and all through this period there were British administrators, British officers, collectors, scientists, historians, scholars, just travelers, all kinds of people who were visiting India, so who lived a good part of their lifetime in India, and they documented and chronicled so many things about India. Only a part of that has actually come to light, even now. So what were the triggers for Dharampal to explore these archives? So that we will see, in the upcoming slides. So he spent nothing less than 2 decades to pore over those archives. Just imagine, it was like a tapasya, just single-handed. It was not like a research team, and absolutely no official support from government or any academy or anything. It was like a one-man tapasya in a lot of sense. Though there were encouragements from some great souls to him, but the effort was his. And as a result of this, he authored 3 seminal works that changed the very perception of Indian historiography as we know it. And then, of course, he also authored a variety of writings on many related subjects. He was a true Nishkama Karma Yogi. In a later part of his life, Dharampal wrote very deep spiritual subjects, and he mentions this Nishkama Karma Yoga as a kind of adarsha that he adapted for himself. Another interesting trivia. So, with all this poring over British archives and exposing the British colonial lies, so you would think that Dharampal would have a lot of feelings of contempt and hatred towards the West and all that. He actually married a British woman. Okay, so Phyllis Ellen Ford, that was her name, and it was they lived a very cherished and loving married life, and endowed with 3 children. In fact, his daughter Geeta Dharampal also was a great scholar, and she continued the legacy of Dharampal. So that, just what kind of a personality such a generous and large-hearted man with great activist life and then a scholarly life, all in the service of Bharat Mata. So that is Dharampal's brief life sketch. Okay. So what are the key themes in Dharampal's work? So before I delve into individual books, I want to give an overall idea. So these 4 bullets, so these are very important to remember. So what he found, and it is even visible, that there is a persistent sense of subservience to the West held by too many educated Indians. In fact, in this year of 2022, it has come down quite a bit. But immediately after the independence. And, till during the 50s and 60s and 70s, through the 80s, it would have been even more prominent. And it was induced by decades, perhaps a century of colonial indoctrination. So this he discovered. And then he thought this needs to be refuted. So some of the commonly held assumption that, before the British era, there was all around underdevelopment and degeneration in India. And it is only the Britishers who were the saviors, who brought modernity, education, development, everything to India. So this was the commonly held assumption. So he had to refute this, and through painstaking historical investigation based on British archives themselves. And once this is done, what next? So there is an urgent need for, so these are his words, intellectual, psychological unburdening, so that India could come into its own. So basically, so Indian civilization, Indian culture would have just run its course, but it was interrupted and ruptured and burdened by this process of colonization. So what we need is a process of unburdening. It has to be at the intellectual level and the psychological level, so that India could come into its own. And once that is done, the regeneration of Indian society, polity, cultural and economic institutions, all that would take place. So this regeneration needs to be at multiple planes and at multiple levels. So from local village level to the national level. And it needs to be driven by intense self-reflection. See, this is very important. It is not that, so Dharampal never argued in a jingoistic manner that the Indian civilization was 100% perfect, milk and honey flowed and everything was all right. No. He obviously such a scholarly person and a rishi-like personality, he would never do that. So in spite of, admiring the Indian civilization greatly, so he insisted that all this regeneration should be based on intense self-reflection in harmony with the swabhava of our people. So swabhava is inherent nature and determined by their needs, what they really need, right? So everything should be based on one's inherent nature and his or her needs. So a very logical and scientific process this is. So these four bullets are the key themes in all of Dharampal's works. So there have been many works of his. I'm going to take 5 major works here because they resonate the most with the theme of decolonization. So the Panchayat Raj as the basis of Indian polity. So I have given the books in a chronological order. Indian science and technology in the 18th century. Civil disobedience and Indian tradition. The beautiful tree. Indigenous Indian education in the 18th century. Bharatheya, Chitta, Manas and Kala. So these 5 books are have been republished as Dharampal Classics series last year, this being the centenary year. So www.sahityabooks.com, you can visit this website. In fact, I recommend that every library in every school and college, particularly the humanities departments, they need to procure these books, and all the students must be encouraged. In fact, particularly in the humanities departments, the students should be given projects to go through each one of these books and contemplate on the thoughts in these books. So that would greatly serve our purpose of regenerating India. Let's start with the beautiful tree. How did this book come about? So we still have many questions. Were Indians uneducated before the British arrived? Did Brahmins have, okay, they were somewhat educated, let us agree. After all, India has so much of ancient literature. We have the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Mahabharata, the Ayurvedic texts, and but did Brahmins or the upper castes have the monopoly on education before the British arrived? And then, did indigenous schools, was education so costly in India that even in the 19th century, was there a hefty fees in the schools in India? Do we have, so if you say no to all this, do we have proofs, evidence for any of this? So these are the questions you normally encounter. Natural. So Dharampal set out to answer all these questions. How did the trigger come out? So in 1930, right in the cave of the lion, in the Chatham House in London, Mahatma Gandhi made this statement, very bold statement. Today, India is more illiterate than it was 50 or 100 years ago. Because the British administrators, when they came to India, instead of taking hold of things as they were, began to root them out. They scratched the soil to look for the root. They, instead of nurturing the root, they left the root exposed and the beautiful tree perished. So he gave this metaphor called the beautiful tree for the Indian indigenous education system. And Gandhi, it's not just this one quote. Gandhiji dealt on this subject in detail in his writings, particularly the book Is Decolonization. And this was challenged by British educationists. They were astonished and shocked because they were thinking that they were the ones. So there's a lot of correspondence between the famous British educationist Act, I think that was his name, who challenged Gandhi. And Gandhi said, this is my conviction, but I am not a researcher or historian. So he requested many Indian scholars to explore this topic. But unfortunately, in the heat of freedom movement, that never caught on. But it was left to Dharampal to take this up. And he ultimately provided the wonderful answers for all these questions. So what is this book all about? The Beautiful Tree. So essentially, there is very less that Dharampal wrote himself in this book. It is essentially the compilation of the documents of a survey of indigenous education, primarily ordered by Thomas Munro, for whom we have a statue in the city of Chennai, who was the governor of Madras in 1822. So these documents contain the details of indigenous schools and institutions of higher learning sent by the collectors of 21 districts of the extensive Madras presidency. So in the erstwhile Madras presidency, you had all parts of Tamil Nadu, some parts of Kerala, also Karnataka and Andhra included. So similar details from Bengal, Punjab, Gujarat, and several other provinces were sought after, and they were all this documentation was available in the British archives already. So Dharampal just dug all of them out and compiled them. And what picture that emerged out of it? It was a fascinating picture of the extent, inclusiveness, and sophistication of the then prevailing system of education in India. So I'm not going to, we don't have time to go over this. I'll just give you some flashes. So what was found was that almost every village in a particular district, in the jurisdiction of every collector, had one or more schools. They were the schools operated, what we call as Thinnai Pallikudam in Tamil. They operated out of the houses of the teachers, or in a local temple, or in some community hall, or even in some open spaces under the trees. And in the schools, both boys and girls were admitted. There were students from all castes. In fact, there is a caste-wise kind of a census of students enrolled. So there were Brahmins, there were merchant communities, there were trader communities, there were agricultures, there were students from the Shudra communities. All communities were given education on basic subjects like the languages. So in many provinces, the mother tongues of the majority of the people, that was the language of instruction. So in the Tamil speaking areas, it was Tamil, and in the Telugu speaking areas, it was Telugu. And in some areas, multiple languages were offered, and basic mathematics like basic arithmetic and the tables and whatever mathematical knowledge was necessary to carry out transactions, all that was taught. And it was taught in a very, in some traditional methods like rote learning, right? So just memorize all the tables, the multiplication tables. So that was one part. And there was also some very, very fun-filled and entertaining ways, like mathematics was taught through puzzles. And there was also moral education by telling stories from the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and the folk legends. And all this data was compiled into those documents. Okay, so this the process of writing this book, it was essentially data collection. Not just that, deduction of facts from the data and the corroboration with different sources. It's not so you cannot simply trust the data, though it was sent by the collectors. It could be possible that there is some inaccuracy. So there was corroboration with different sources and deriving an overall historical insight through this. So in fact, this indigenous education system was found so good that in one of the British Parliament debates, the British education minister, the then British education minister, mentioned that look at the system in India, it is so nice, it is taking schooling to all people. We don't have such a good system in the Britain, so we should adopt some of these methods. So that's how good it was. And this whole beautiful tree perished, according to Gandhiji. So how do we, the moment you say this, quite a few people are agitated. Then they say, no, you are creating such a rosy picture of all this. Well, we have several literary and historical evidences in Indian languages like Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam, Bengali, Gujarati, Punjabi, that match with the observations in the book. Unfortunately, so because there was no systematic scholarship to collate all this data, it has not really come to the fore, but they are starting to come now, only after the popularization and the spread of this book, Beautiful Tree, when it was translated into many Indian languages. So just to give you one anecdotal example, right? So Sri Narayana Guru, the great Vedantin and social reformer from Kerala. So as you all know, the community he was born into, Yidavas, so they were treated very badly by some of the landowning and dominant communities in the Kerala, and many of them were employed as laborers in extracting liquor, working in the farms, and all that. And their life was miserable. They didn't even receive some education and all that. So this was at the start of. So again, Narayana Guru was born in Kerala, which was under the Travancore the Swadeshi Maharaja rule. But even in such a community with so many hardships and discrimination, there was a lot of traditional learning. In fact, in every Ijava village, there were elders and people who knew how to read and write. And they used to teach the youngsters. And Narayana Guru himself, he was a very scholarly person. So he, as you know, he authored great works in poetry and prose, both in Malayalam and Sanskrit, and also in Tamil, a few works. So how did he acquire such a great erudition and scholarship? And he records that in his household, in the Iyava household, there was a lot of learning and knowledge of traditional sciences like Ayurveda. So in spite of a community that faced discrimination and hardships, there was this education that was alive and active. So what Dharampal's book says is not something that is exaggeration, right? So we can give many such examples from many regions of India. And the next great seminal book, Indian Science and Technology in the 18th Century. So this book, this again is essentially the compilation of several articles by early British officers, scholars, and observers about the Indian sciences in the 18th century. And in this book, Dharampal not just compiled them, but he wrote a very detailed introduction. I mean, the introduction itself runs to some 70, 80 pages. It explains the context and background of each of these articles and builds a collective, complete picture of how the Indian science and technology was actually quite active in the 18th century. So some examples from this book. This is very interesting. I mean, particularly if you are a student of science, you should read this book. There is one article called Brahmin's Observatory at Benares by Sir Robert Barker, which was written in the year 1777. So this man, Sir Barker, visits Benares, and there is a big Gurukulam teaching astronomy. I mean, the Jyotisha science to a lot of students of many communities. See, when we say this, so you might be now wondering that today, when we see the Sanskrit learning, and it is predominantly there only with the Brahmins. So that is the general impression now. But this is not true. The portion of scriptures that are dealing with, let us say, rituals, the performing the homas, performing the pujas, right? So that kind of traditional scriptures, probably it is true that they were specifically studied only by the Brahmins and the temple worshipping communities, because others didn't really need that. They only needed some basic texts for worshipping. But the other sciences like Ayurveda or Jyotisha or the agriculture related science, mathematics. So these, the Sanskrit texts related to these sciences were widely taught to many communities, and they all had knowledge of Sanskrit enough to understand and study these sciences. Okay, so and in the colonial language, all teachers, all traditional Indian teachers are called Brahmins. So it is not to be assumed that only Brahmins were admitted into that Gurukulam. So here, he records many things as how the astronomy is taught in this Gurukulam. You know, the traditional almanac, calculating the time, predicting the climate, and using the sundial to study the seasons and the times of the day, and many indigenous instruments. So if you visit Jantar Mantar in Delhi, you see indigenous astronomical instruments built in India. So in this Banaras observatory also, there are some instruments like this, and how they are studying the texts of Aryabhata, Varahamihira, etc. So all that is recorded in this article. And there's another interesting article, a proof that Hindus had the binomial theorem by Reuben Burrow. So here he talks about texts like Bijaganita, Leelavati, Bhaskaracharya's Leelavati, and Brahmagupta's Brahma Samhita. So these are renowned mathematical texts of India, and how these contain material. I'm not again going to get into what is binomial theorem and all that. So it's a very interesting article where he says that before Briggs, before Pascal, and of course, certainly much before Newton, the Hindus had the knowledge of binomial theorem. Okay, and then there is another article called the Hindu Algebra by H.T. Colebrook which was written in 1870. This again talks about Bijaganita and other things. And regarding medical sciences, the operation of inoculation of the smallpox as performed in Bengal. So even before the smallpox vaccine was invented, many communities had their own traditional knowledge of dealing with these diseases. And of course, India had one. And this has been documented by one Colt to Roe Colt to Dr. Oliver Colt. In fact, this entire inoculation procedure, as observed by this person, is described in detail in this letter, which was later published as an article. And there is another article by Major General Sir Alexander Walker on Indian agriculture. This is wonderful. So here he talks about the crop patterns, the very scientific approach of Indian farmers in choosing their crop patterns, their harvesting cycles, the irrigation system, water management, and how do they deal with drought. So it's quite a detailed article. And then the method of making the best mortar at Madras in East India. So this is an article by Isaac Pike. So each of these articles are actually quite detailed. It's not a one-liner. In fact, these British writers and enthusiasts, some of them were actually doctors and scientists also. So they studied this thing in extensive detail. And in all these articles, you actually see great admiration for Indian science and technology. In fact, there is never a sense of ridicule. And they are surprised, and there is a tone of wonder in every one of these articles. And this mode of manufacturing iron in central India by Major James Franklin. So these are examples. So there are some more in the book. So it was a seminal book by Dharampal. And as you see, this is just 18th century. This is important. So he, as recorded by the British officers. So this means that, to arrive at such things, India must have had centuries of scientific and technological traditions, right? Which is a no-brainer, right? So when we go visit some of these great temples in Tanjavur or Khajuraho or Konark, I mean, phenomenal architectural marvels they are. And the Ayurveda, I mean, nothing to speak about. Many Western countries are adopting Ayurveda now, and yoga has become a global discipline. So there is blatant proof in front of everyone's eyes that India has such great scientific and technological heritage. And the other two books, the Panchayat Raj as the basis of Indian polity. So this was the first book of Dharampal. So this again presents extracts from the Constituent Assembly debates. So when India was about to get freedom, all the leaders of the freedom movement, they sat together and they were discussing how India's governing structure should be. So the place of Panchayat Raj, because the Panchayat system is something which is somewhat unique to India. And it is Gandhi had great admiration for this system, local governance, grassroots governance, and all that. So this debate led to the mention of Panchayat Raj among the non-enforceable directive principles of the Constitution. Of course, at a later date, there was the Panchayat Raj Bill that was passed. and we still see this in action. Even as I speak today, the local body elections are announced in Tamil Nadu, and the campaigning has been going on. So, without such debate, when they were trying to make up a constitution for India, because of the colonial influence on that, we still see a lot of colonial influence in our constitution. In fact, many people, if you read a criticism about the constitution, they say that it was largely the British constitution, and then it was a cut paste from some constitution of USA and a few other countries. There was very less original thought in the making of all our constitution. To some extent, that criticism is valid, but still, concepts like Panchayat Raj are mentioned in the constitution. That is very important. That even at that time, there was some thought among the leaders, Indian political leaders, on these lines. So when Dharampal studied this, so it gave him an understanding of classical Indian society and the process of its subversion by the British. So this kindled his further interest, and that led to many of his other books. And the other interesting book, so Civil Disobedience and Indian Tradition. So we all know that Mahatma Gandhi popularized this satyagraha, or the civil disobedience movement. But then there is a narrative, a motivated narrative, that actually Gandhi did not get this idea from the Indian tradition at all, and attributing it to the Christian and Western Enlightenment ideals. So Gandhi got this idea from the Bible, which says that in a non-violent manner you have to oppose your oppressors. And people like Leo Tolstoy, whom Gandhi admired a lot, the Russian writer. So Gandhi got this idea from those sources. So there is a narrative that was built up, but which is totally wrong. In fact, Gandhi himself has recorded that he got it from the Indian tradition. The very word he gave, satyagraha, is actually found in one of the Puranas. So, and very interestingly, Dharampal presents a real incident of satyagraha that happened in several cities of Banaras, several cities of Bihar and the Banaras region in 1810 and 11 against the imposition of a new house tax by the British administration. In fact, the local population did not revolt or resort to violence, but they just stopped all their work, and they staged what can be called as an early form of satyagraha. And this went on for close to 2 years till Britishers abolished that tax. So Gandhi derived inspiration from such incidents. So this was again an interesting book. And Bharatheya, Chitta, Manas and Kala. So this book was written in Hindi, but later translated into English by Jitendra Bajaj. So all the previous books, all that I mentioned, is the compilation of historical data, but this presents a philosophical perspective from which all other works of Dharampal needs to be read. So what does it contain? It contains reflection on. So there are these 3 words he uses: Chitta, Manas and Kala. So Chitta is consciousness. So what Dharampal argues is that there is something called Indian consciousness, which is very peculiar. And then the Indian sense of time, Kala, the way Indians view time, right? So there is this concept like yugas and all that. And that is very peculiar. And then Manas, the civilizational essence of being an Indian. So these are the things that he reflects upon. And this book contains some important discussion on spiritual versus material knowledge, para and apara vidya, discussions on varna system, and modernity in the Indian context and all that. Very important book. I just put a quote here from the book. The attempt at imitating the world and following every passing fad can hardly lead us anywhere. We shall have no options in the world till we evolve a conceptual framework of our own based on an understanding of our own chitta and kala. Such a framework will at least provide us with a basis for discriminating between right and wrong, between what may be useful for us, what is futile. And it will allow us to define, though tentatively, our way of living and being. We shall thus have some sense of the direction along which we must proceed in order to bring India back into her own. So that is the theme of this book. So to conclude my talk, I'm just presenting. So we started this talk with decolonization as a major thing, and then went through how Dharampal's works give a very good reference material in this narrative. And now I just put some challenges on while building decolonization narratives. So one problem, genuine and legitimate decolonizing narratives and measures, they are routinely branded as jingoistic, ultra-nationalist, saffronization, Hindutva imposition, obscurantist, backward, regressive, impractical, etc., etc. So who is doing such branding? So it is done by the forces that are opposed to decolonization. So you may be wondering, who is opposed to decolonization? There are several forces, both within and outside India. They are opposed to decolonization. So one group, the fundamentalist and fanatical sections among Muslims and Christians, the Islamists and the Christians. Why? Because both these religions have some kind of a colonial element attached with them. Because there are a section of a fundamentalist section among Muslims, they still justify the Islamic invasion, they justify the temple destruction, they justify the oppression of Hindus by the Muslim rulers and all that. And obviously that section is opposed to all these decolonizing narrative. And the Christian conversions started happening in India only with the British rule. So obviously the Christian church and the fanatics inside the Christian religions obviously do not want to popularize the view that Indian culture was the great, etc. Because that works, that completely nullifies the narratives that the church has built inside India. But this is among the Muslims and Christians also, there have been people who are patriots and who were at the forefront of decolonization. For example, if you take Christian community, there is Claude Alvarez, a Goan Christian, great scholar. He was one of the foremost disciples of Dharampal. In fact, the other India press that published many of Dharampal's books, it is being run by him. And then there is J.C. Kumarappa, Joseph Cornelius Kumarappa, who was a great Gandhian himself. And we had Dr. Abdul Kalam, who gave an Indian dream. So it is, but there is the fundamentalist and fanatical sections certainly are opposed to decolonization. And the next force is the leftist, secessionist, and other anti-Indian political ideologies. Obviously, these ideologies believe that India is not one nation, right? In fact, they say that there was never a nation called India. Only Britishers created a nation called India and all that crap. So that ideology is obviously opposed. And the secularized Hindus who are alienated from their own tradition and culture, not having come out of colonial indoctrination. A lot of them believe in the colonial narratives. large sections of Western academics, scholars, and media who do not want India to remain integrated and emerge as a powerful nation. And they think that the colonial legacy should prevail in India, right? So it is like they don't want India to become too powerful and remain united, actually. So from the decolonization, from the people who create and propagate decolonization narratives, there are some challenges. You know, these narratives may tend to veer towards the other extreme sometimes. So as I said, the Hindu society was ever perfect without any flaws. The ancient Indians made all kinds of scientific invention. You know, the rishis discovered quantum physics and all that. We had aeroplanes in India. So these kind of over-exaggerated claims, it may lead to that. And sometimes outright denial of problematic areas like caste discrimination, caste conflicts. So when Dharampal recorded in Beautiful Tree that people from all castes and communities were admitted to school, so that is one part of the story. But that doesn't mean that there was absolutely no caste discrimination, right? Because we all know that there were many initiatives in the 20th century that were undertaken to remove social evils like untouchability, to empower depressed classes and all that. So the outright denial of problematic areas in history, instead of studying and presenting them in context and deriving learnings from them. So this also, so there needs to be caution while creating these decolonization narratives. It's never like a black and white type of picture. So there are shades of gray here. But decolonization as a theme is very important, and it must be undertaken. So I end this talk with this great quote from Sri Aurobindo. The country whose young men are imbued with the glory of the past, the pain of the present, and the dreams of the future, that country always moves on the path of progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ji, for delivering an unique and wonderful talk on Sri Dharampal's work, valuable resources in decolonization narratives. I also express my sincere thanks to the participants for attending and listening this talk. Now the audience may ask questions and they can interact with our chief guest. We have
sorry, I took a bit more time, it looks like. Yeah, but I'll stay on and I'll answer all the questions.
If any questions, audience can interact with our chief guest. Dr. Srinivasan Ji, you raised the hand. Ji, you can unmute and you can ask questions. Srinivasan Ji.
Dr. Srinivasan Madurai, go ahead. Okay, meanwhile, anyone?
I think no questions from audience. Sambaji.
Sir,
Could you hear me now?
Yeah. Badrinath Ji.
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, sir. Brilliant presentation, sir, about scholar whom we have not heard. Lecture ஆரம்பிக்கும்போதே you started by asking the question, how many of you here know about Dharmapal? Honestly, I was not one among them, sir, but after listening to your lecture, it was so wonderful, and I think, as you told, libraries should have a book on Dharampal's writings and other things, sir. Sir, my only observation or comment, no questions, sir. His views on education. We still follow the Macaulay system of education.
Right.
Why we have not come over that? Because education, I mean, marks is not the correct standard for judging a student's personality or
Right.
student's potential.
Right.
We have come from all things we are freed ourselves from several British impacts, but not from the system of education. Our Gurukula system of education is not there.
Right.
Free, open, sitting under the teacher near Upanishads, sitting near the feet of the teacher.
Yes.
But why still we are following the Macaulay system? Can we come out of this?
Yeah. So see, this is again a very big topic. I will briefly answer you. So one is that so the moment our whole orientation, right? So it is not just education, right? So your governance, the way your governance is, the way your all other your industry, your government departments, your everything operates. So we are used to this what do you call a mass and public schooling system of the 20th century. But we are even within this system. We are constantly trying to bring in many changes, right? So if you see the emphasis on marks, so now it has been slowly coming down. In fact, if you see the new education policy that has been recently released, a lot of stress has been put on the actual learning and
practical
the priority of marks. But still, you really need some kind of a benchmark like marks because for higher education you need some kind of a entry criteria, and there are other concepts like homeschooling, for example, or NIOS, open schooling,
National Institute,
right? So the government has recognized all these systems of education, and quite a few people are actually experimenting with these systems of education. So I think in India, a lot of even upper middle class people, right, who have a lot of financial security, but even those people are not experimenting some of these educational alternative educational practices. And then the middle class, they are always insecure about getting a job and employment and all that. But at least some courageous and bold souls, they will come out, and slowly it will create an impact on the mainstream schooling itself, right? So see, you also need to consider some practical things, right? So the Gurukula system had less number of people and all that. We cannot really completely go back to that old system. So see, again, what Dharampal is talking, if you have noticed the slides, he is not using the word revival. See, what you are talking about is revival. He is talking about the word regeneration, right? So there is a difference between both. So revival is going back to the old practice as it existed. But regeneration means to take whatever that was best in the system and put it into practice in a different form.
Because the same was echoed by Swami Vivekananda, who told that education was the manifestation of perfection already in man.
Yes.
We want to make education so that it would feed the masses. It should be practical. Education should be practical.
Exactly. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Yes. Sir, I am Dr. Srinivasan from Madurai.
Namaste, sir.
Namaste. See, I am an independent academician practicing on Sankhya philosophy and Patanjali Yoga philosophy. At the same time, I am also an ardent lover of Mahatma Gandhi, as I have read Gandhian thoughts and peacemaking processes.
Okay, wonderful.
Having understood all these things, thank you very much. Having understood all these things and your presentation of the slides are excellent, I would say. But unfortunately, you have made certain contradictory remarks, which I would like to point out, not accuse, but to understand better about those slides. the question is, you have said the Britishers ravaged India during the British rule.
Right.
And they looted $42 trillion.
Right, right.
I would like to know on what basis it has been arrived at, if you have any statistics on that, to just to justify our claim.
So
that would be
in the slide itself, I had actually put the picture of that article that said $45 trillion, isn't it? It was written by a British writer himself. How he arrived at that figure. And you know, our own Shashi Tharoor. So Shashi Tharoor does not belong to the Hindutva camp. He is in the Congress party. He has written a wonderful book called An Era of Darkness. Right? I'm sure you know about this book. So he has in fact he has a complete chapter on the economic exploitation. So you may refer to that book. I don't know whether he has arrived at this figure, but I just put it so that it is very catchy.
At the same time, my second point is that you just injected that Brahmins were dominating the Gurukula in those, periods, is rather unacceptable to me, because
no, I didn't say that. That was put as a question.
Let me complete it, please. May I complete it?
Yeah.
May I complete it? Because they have come so many colleges and schools, and I would like to point out that American college was established in 1881, and the Mullai Periyar Dam was constructed by no other personality than who was a Britisher. So they have done wonderful things also, because these people in the old Bharath was either they were nomadic foresters or villagers, are not fully educated. So what they were trying to give is more education and bring up culture and tradition, so that their the lifestyle will change. So you cannot call it as colonization. And independent, history is something different from what you are trying to, mention here.
Not correct. See,
I would like to have your clarification on this.
No, I completely differ with you. In fact, I highly recommend you to read the books of Dharampal. Okay. See, colonization is not something, a word that I coined, right? So, and it is not something that is specific to India alone. If you deny that there is nothing called colonization, it is like saying there is nothing called, I don't know what to call, World War II. It is the reality of colonization as a brutal process of subjugation and exploitation is well accepted by all historians all over the world. Okay. And so is the process of decolonization. Yeah, you talked about some benevolent British like engineers like Benny Cook. In fact, I would even go one step ahead and say that the articles which Dharampal compiled, those articles themselves were written by Britishers, right? So it is they who documented some of those indigenous education systems, which we are currently using to prove that the beautiful tree was destroyed. So when we say colonization, it doesn't mean that every Britisher on the soil was like a demon or a asura like that. Right? So as a whole, the colonization project was certainly aimed at subjugation and exploitation. But as a side effect of that, there is also interaction of two cultures, right? Because the British rule came here, the British commanders came, the British governors came, the collectors came, but the engineers and poets and the writers and some very sympathetic people also came. So when they interacted with India, the Indian culture, they took a very empathetic view. So it is an exception, but that doesn't mean that colonization didn't exist, right? So it is never a black and white story. So I hope you got that point.
The next point is about the medical education. Unfortunately, you said Miss Sri Dharampal was enrolled in London School of Commerce, right? And his wife was from Britain. Secondly, Mahatma Gandhi got his barrister only from London, and also Sir Rajaji, he got his barrister from London. So also our ex-finance minister P.H. Chidambaram got his barrister only from London. So how do you find? I accuse the Catholicism, rather critical, and they are trying to monopolize that education is something I am unable to accept it, sir.
Who is trying to monopolize education?
You said the Britishers were trying to monopolize through Macaulay's education.
No. See, that is the whole thing about barristery. So okay. See, this needs a lot of. Unfortunately, we really don't have that much of time to discuss this whole thing in detail, right? So, if you are familiar with the British history, every system that Britishers created here, the railways, for example, or their judiciary, the court system, or their education system. So everything, obviously, the primary focus was to rule India, to dominate India, and to exploit India. But this infrastructure and the frameworks obviously have some benefits also, right? So once you create, they destroyed the indigenous court system of India, right? Which was solving all kinds of disputes at the local level very efficiently. And so much has been written about it. But they replaced this with their own courts. And they made a criteria that only someone who becomes a barrister from London can really represent cases in those courts. So obviously Indians didn't have a choice, right? Whoever wanted to aspire. So all this, you are talking as if they were some devas who bestowed their blessings on us. No, this kind of mindset is completely wrong. In fact, you have to read, you have to really read Dharampal's works.
The mindset
you are talking is based on the colonial indoctrination. This is exactly the disease that Dharampal wanted to cure.
I'm sorry, it is not my, exaggeration or my this thing, but it is a reality. That's what I am trying to.
Anyway, I think let's move on. I think I have answered it enough.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Thank you, sir.
Sir, before that, a little small observation only, not a question, of course.
Yes, of course.
See, actually, the challenges which you have said, the challenges are more dangerous from the secular Hindus than the missionaries or Islamization or the communists. See, for example, one example I will tell you, maybe it's a counter to Dr. Srinivasan also. He talked about Benny who had constructed the Mullai Periyar Dam. In fact, he completed the Mullai Periyar Dam. He is not the only person who started and completed it. See, it started from Sethupathi Rajas, 100 years before Pennikul.
Right.
Many attempts were made. The idea is that the west flowing river water should be diverted so that Tamil Nadu will benefit.
Right.
The concept 100 years back, it was developed.
Right.
Many attempts were made to build it.
Right.
But of course,
True.
Completed it.
Yeah, see that. Yes, exactly. See, he was a good person. So let us not villainize Benny Quay.
No, we are not villains.
Right. But unfortunately, there is this narrative built up saying that the Britishers are like gods. You know,
right.
And they did more good than bad. That is a completely false story.
Right.
In fact, They did a lot of
No,
bad.
instead of, I'm sorry to interfere here. Instead of calling them as God, it is better we don't call them as.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any more observations, sir? Sambat sir, you were saying something.
Yeah, there is also a great example of the colony of Kargalam. That is also a great example of the engineering of the dam.
Yes. Yes. Sir, Sambat sir, you
Yes,
wanted to
yes,
say
sir.
something more?
That is one point. Another thing, that concept of Satyagraha, all these years we are thinking that Gandhiji borrowed it from some Western concept. Dharampal has actually broke that narrative, and you have very nicely explained that how the citizens of Banaras resisted the house tax.
Yes.
These are all some of the points. That's why I am in the beginning itself that we have to revisit the works of Dharampal so that a better understanding of our ancient past.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that we simply sit and be proud of that alone.
Yes.
How to implement in the present conditions.
Exactly.
And
yes.
that is the purpose of this series of seminars.
Absolutely.
And I'm really thankful to you, sir, for such a vivid presentation and connecting the decolonization concept. We, in fact, started in philosophy. The ICPR for last 1 year, many seminars and talks with this concept of decolonizing Indian mind. In fact, we had one seminar in Panchayat College also earlier.
Okay.
So, on this occasion, I informed the audience and others that we are going to continue this kind of lecture series on Dharampal to bring out our earlier way of living. Sir, thank you. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and the explanation of all these questions.
Yes.
Now, I invite Dr. M. Yoganandam, Director, EDAL Lead Coaching Academy, Ambatu, to deliver vote of thanks.
Yeah. I now would like formally conclude the session by proposing the vote of thanks. Once again, warm evening to all. On behalf of our organization, VBUSS Tamil Nadu, and for our respected office bearer members of VBUSS, Dr. Kailas Chandra Sharma ji, National President, Dr. Narendra Kumar Taneja ji, National Secretary, Sri Nagaraj Reddy ji, National Joint Secretary, Sri Prakash Chandra ji, National Organizing Secretary, Sri K.N. Raghunandan ji, National Joint Organizing Secretary, Dr. Prasant Gupta ji, National Executive Member, and other national and state executive members and office bearers, and also on behalf of our VBUSS Tamil Nadu Organizing Secretary, Sri Sundar ji, Advisory Committee members, Core Committee members, and Executive Committee members, I thank to Almighty for strengthening us to work for education and for our nation through organizing such a Moment's national webinar about Sri Dharampal'S in a successful and memorable manner through this online platform. We are extremely grateful to our Chief Guest, Sri Jatayu ji, for embellishing this event with his profound knowledge. Last but foremost, I warmly thank our genial participants for attending this webinar with great interest and for the successful completion of the program. Thank you all once again. Now we stand for National Anthem.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा निश्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
Thank you, Ji.
Thank you, Ji.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you for all.
It's a very successful webinar.
வால சீனிவாசன் வந்திருக்காரு பார்த்தேன். ஜி
உங்களுக்கு தெரியுமா
பேசுறேன் உங்ககிட்ட பேசுறேன்.
Okay, okay. Actually, you know, he is our student in Panchayat Raj College.
தெரியும்.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sampath sir, thank you sir.
Oh, thank you, Badri.
Sorry sir. ஜட்டாயு சார் இந்த மாதிரி அப்பப்போ பேசினாதான் நம்மளுடைய இந்தியாவுடைய ரிச் ஹெரிட்டேஜ் அண்ட் கல்ச்சர் ட்ரெடிஷன் இதெல்லாம் அடுத்த ஜெனரேஷனுக்கு நம்ம சொல்ல முடியும்.
கட்டாயம் பேசுவோம் சார், பேசுவோம்.
பத்ரி வந்து விவேகானந்தா காலேஜ் அசிஸ்டன்ட் ப்ரொஃபசர்.
ஓ சரி.
பிலாசபி.
ஓ சரி.
நமஸ்கார் ஜடாயு ஜி, ரொம்ப அருமையா இருந்தது. உங்க Facebook உங்க ஃபேன்ல வரேன் நானு.
சரி சார், நன்றி.
டைரக்டர் அண்ட் பிரின்சிபல் உங்களை அடிக்கடி பாக்கணும்னு நினைச்சேன். அட்லீஸ்ட் நம்ம பிபி ஹையர் எஜுகேஷன் நமக்கு வாய்ப்பு ஏற்படுத்தி கொடுத்துக்கிறாங்க. உங்களுக்கு நன்றி. இந்த வாய்ப்பு ஏற்படுத்தி கொடுத்த அவங்களுக்கு நன்றி.
தேங்க்யூ மாதவர்ஜி. தேங்க்யூ மாதவர்ஜி.
தேங்க்யூ சோ மச். ஒரு நல்ல முயற்சி இது. ரொம்ப அருமையாவும் பயனுள்ளதாவும் இருந்ததுங்க. நான் உங்ககிட்ட நிறைய தடவை பேசணும்னு நினைச்சே இருந்தேன். வாய்ப்பு இப்படிதான் கிடைச்சிருக்கு.
சரி சரி, ரொம்ப நன்றி சார்.
நன்றி சார்.
உங்க இதெல்லாம் படிச்சிருக்கிறேன் நானு, ஆனா பார்க்கதான் முடியல. இறையருள்ல சீக்கிரம் நம்ம சந்திக்கிறது. சரி சரி,
ஓகே.
ஓகே ஜி,
சைன் அவுட் பண்ணிடலாமா?
பண்ணிடலாம்.
ரொம்ப நன்றி, பார்க்கலாம்.
நன்றி.